Well, hey, folks, welcome to the Rob Breakenridge Show. Thank you so much for joining us. A closer look this week at everything going on in Alberta with the Alberta Legislature beginning its fall sitting. Of course, the backdrop to that is the ongoing teachers' strike, which seems to be coming to a head as the Premier has made it clear that back to work legislation is coming. They can't get the teachers back to work by other means. So that's dominating as the legislature gets underway. But of course, there are a lot of other issues percolating and some other things happening that are going to coincide with this session of the legislature. We've got a deadline coming up on that Forever Canadian petition, the Thomas Lukaszuk petition. We've got the Grey Cup coming up, which is supposed to be when the Prime Minister makes some new announcements about major projects that could or may not include a new pipeline project. So there's all of that going on. And of course, some other aspects of the Alberta government's legislative agenda. And what's interesting is on Thursday, they did table Bill 1 in the Alberta legislature, but that wasn't the back to work legislation for teachers. That's going to be Bill 2, which the Alberta government says the plan is to table that on Monday. So we'll talk a little bit more about what Bill 1 was coming up a little bit later on. We'll also have a conversation about everything going on in Alberta politics. Really looking forward to a conversation with the hosts of the Discourse podcast, political insiders and veterans, Erika Barootes and Cheryl Oates. They'll be with us, and we'll break down everything we should be watching for during this session of the Alberta Legislature, with, of course, the teacher strike being one of the big issues right now. But there's healthcare, there's a bunch of other stuff, too. But let's start with where things stand on the education front. Thousands of teachers rallied at the Alberta Legislature on Thursday as the speech from the throne was being read, and the Premier answered some questions about her plans to table back to work legislation. By the way, amidst all of that, there was a petition drive that's been approved. There's actually now a recall campaign targeting Demetrius Nicolaitis, who, of course, is the Minister of Education. But as for back to work legislation, again, the Premier says it's coming. Bill 2 set to be tabled in the legislature on Monday. But speaking with reporters on Thursday, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith says there is still time to work something out with teachers.
There is still time for the teachers to tell us that they want to ask the members to return to schooling and to see if we can negotiate. That's what we tried to do on Friday of last week. We tried to get them to agree to go back to school, and then we would do enhanced mediation, which would end November 20th, to see that if we could get to an agreement on an expedited timeframe, and they rejected that. And so the precondition has to be getting kids back to school. And so far, they have been unwilling to do that. It's not to say that they won't have an agreement with us in the next 72 hours, but we feel that it's not going to move in that direction. They came back with an offer that moves us even further apart rather than closer together. So we would like to see a realistic approach that allows us to address the issues of classroom complexity, but we've got to get kids back in the classroom.
Okay, now look, I think this is politically risky for the government. We've seen opinion polls suggest that the public is largely sympathetic to the teachers or on the teachers' side in all of this. And if the Alberta government is going to force them back to work or in some way impose a contract, I think they got to show that they're at least taking steps to address the concerns that have been raised. I think there are a lot of legitimate concerns about per-student funding in Alberta when it comes to class sizes, dealing with complexity and special needs and all of that. Not to mention the fact that Alberta just needs a lot of new schools, given how fast our population is growing, young families coming to Alberta, et cetera. Now, the NDP have made it clear they are going to vigorously oppose back to work legislation. They're highlighting the fact that not only is the Alberta government doing this, but they're going to limit debate on this bill. This may even have to involve using the notwithstanding clause when it comes to some collective bargaining rights that come into play here. So the NDP are characterizing this as an attack on labor rights. The Premier was asked about that on Thursday, how she responds to those accusations.
Well, I think the NDP province of Manitoba has essential services legislation on teachers. And we didn't go that way because we respect the collective bargaining process, and strikes are part of the collective bargaining process. But when you get to a point where irreparable harm is being caused to kids, that's where we have to draw a line, and we have to make sure those kids are back in class. We've never had a strike of this nature or magnitude before, and or one that has carried on this long. My reading is that Premier Ralph Klein ordered back to work on the strike in 2002 after 3 weeks. This one will be a little bit longer than 3 weeks. I think 18 days, working days in total. And so, or maybe just under. And so we want to make sure that the kids are back in class so they don't have any more disruption in their learning.
All right, well, joining us for more on the return to the Alberta Legislature and everything going on in Alberta, very pleased to welcome to the show the co-hosts of the Discourse podcast. They are from opposite sides of the political aisle, veteran political insiders. Very pleased to welcome to the program Erika Barootes, Cheryl Oates. Ladies, thank you so much for joining us here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. I mean, let's start with what's going on with the teachers as teachers get set to rally, and it seems like this whole situation is coming to a head as the premier has really signaled that there is going to be back to work legislation. Let me start with you on that, Erika. Is that what you're expecting, and what are kind of the political risks of going down this path, do you think?
Well, I definitely think everyone was hoping we wouldn't get here, including the premier herself. But I expect that. I don't think with neither groups, the government or ATA, sitting at the table and being back there this week, I think the only option to get students back in classrooms would be to legislate. And I actually suspect it will be tabled and passed quite quickly in hopes of having that return to the classroom. But then there's the work to rule that I suspect the ATA might leverage, meaning that they'll return to work, but only within their contract. So no extracurriculars, no additional marking. So we'll see what that would look like. But I think there's a lot of parents that are just looking forward to some type of education in the future, and they'll continue to negotiate. But I don't think this is ending anytime soon. And we've seen it in other jurisdictions. Cheryl can probably talk about Saskatchewan on the implications because she was running the NDP campaign there during a teacher strike. But there's political risk. Yeah. There's political risk on all sides.
Yeah. I mean, parents obviously want to see this end, but we've seen surveys suggesting, Cheryl, that parents are on the sides of teachers in all of this, or at least the public is. The NDP has said they're going to vigorously oppose any back to work legislation. How should they be approaching this, do you think?
Yeah, I think, yes, you're right. The public opinion shows that the majority of people in Alberta are siding with teachers. And that is a number that the government should be paying very close attention to. The other number the government should be paying very close attention to is the percentage of UCP supporters that are siding with teachers right now. And in the last survey that we saw, that's 28%. And as you see the number of not just NDP supporters, which is overwhelmingly supportive of teachers, but the number of UCP supporters siding with the teachers in this debate, that is a sign of real political risk for this government if it continues down this road. And certainly legislating teachers back to work right now is the nuclear option. Basically, the government is saying, we choose not to go back to the table. We choose not to do the hard work. We choose not to reach a deal through negotiation. We're just going to legislate teachers back to work. And that doesn't solve the underlying problems that teachers are striking to try to solve, and the underlying problems that overwhelmingly parents of kids in school agree exist. So, I mean, we've seen in jurisdictions across this country, governments choose not to legislate teachers back to work because of the incredible political risk, and also because courts have proven that this violates charter rights.
Mm-hmm. How solvable, though, do you think these problems are? I mean, certainly per student funding in Alberta, I mean, it has fallen to the lowest in the country, but I mean, unless we're able to build schools in tandem with hiring more teachers, I don't know, can we really address class sizes and some of these challenges, do you think, Cheryl?
I have so little sympathy for this argument that now in 2025, we're in a situation where we are the lowest funded per capita school system, education system in the country, where we don't have enough schools, where we don't have enough teachers, where we don't have enough EAs. This is a problem of the government's creation. They're the ones that chose not to fund education. They're the ones that chose to lay off hundreds of thousands of EAs. They're the ones that chose not to keep building schools and hiring teachers. And I know that right now, and Erika will say this, the province is trying very rapidly to catch up on school construction, but we are in this position because the government's created this problem. And so now we have to come up with creative solutions to deal with the influx of population and the backlog in school funding and school construction that the government created. So I have very little sympathy for the government saying, well, what are we supposed to do? We have all of these problems at once. The government created that problem. The government is demonstrating its own incompetence on managing education.
Well, yeah, what about that, Erika? I mean, we're talking about billions of dollars.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the Alberta government has warned, hey, oil prices are softening. This deficit could really swell. And, there's potentially billions needed to really resolve this issue here.
Yeah, and I think that this is where the conversation comes down to what the government thinks is a fair deal and a 3-year plan to get us to address those things. Like, first off, it wasn't only the Conservatives that didn't give teachers a raise in the last 10 years. So there is 4 years of ownership on the NDP, and I think
But we funded education.
they lack.
We
But
funded
you didn't give
enrollment growth.
teachers a raise, and that's like 90% of the conversation that was happening
No, it's
prior
not.
to the first strike. Either way, like you and I will disagree on this. However, the point is that the government has proposed a deal on salary that gets teachers to be fair market, to get them to be equal with every other jurisdiction, and actually puts them in a very good position in the last year of the contract. So I do think to the point is I think teachers want it to happen yesterday, and the government's saying we have to do this over the contractual agreement of 12 years like we have with every other bargaining table. So, and I think everyone in Alberta can agree that after 10 years of no increase, teachers deserve an increase. I don't think anyone's arguing with that. When it comes to classroom complexities, I mean, the ATA submitted their proposal to the government, which sounds beautiful. It sounds like sunshines and rainbows. However, they didn't cost it. And what they're saying is required immediately is $2.6 billion additional to the $2 billion that the government was investing in this agreement. I think when we look at what is feasible today, that's half of the deficit. I don't think that Albertans, if they broke it down, like what I said, what teachers put together in their proposal sounds beautiful. Is it realistic? And are we dealing with what the government has talked about? No one's fault. 250,000 new people in our province. Like, this is kind
Except
of a
Alberta was
chaotic.
calling.
But really, you can't or say an ad campaign was the direct impact and only impact. We do have a nice place to live. We have lower corporate taxes. We have the lowest personal taxes. Like, there's other things that made this an appealing place than a frickin' billboard. So yes, it didn't help, and I've shit on it before, but I think it's important to look at all the other elements that are impacting the decision right now. And I will point to, I think where the ATA is looking is they're hoping for their Cadillac version of what they want in a deal. And the government is holding them account. And they're just on far opposite ends of the spectrum right now, regardless of if we like it or not. Like, I think they're just talking about different pages. Like, Cheryl, can you actually say that the government should go double into our deficit and have a $2.6 billion?
Erika, who doesn't enter negotiation asking for everything that they want and need?
Well,
This is the teachers
I would say you should also
demonstrating. Just
maybe
let me finish.
cost it.
Just let me finish. This is the teachers demonstrating to Albertans. This is the current situation that education is in. And if this was just about salaries, we wouldn't be in this position. This is about a complete reset on how the government views and respects the education system and those working inside it. And it is imperative for the teachers to demonstrate to the public, this is the situation we're in. If we wanted to catch up with the rest of Canada and even just be average, this is how much it would cost. And maybe at the end of the day, through negotiation, that's not what the government can afford. But that is what negotiation is all about. Of course, the teachers should come to the table asking for everything the education system needs.
In any argument or any negotiation, I would hope that you'd cost it to share what the reality actually is. And they didn't do that. So to me, I get where you're coming from. They're going to ask for the moon and maybe get a star, if that's the reality. But I'm saying it's really disingenuous to not cost out and explain the impact to the taxpayers, to the government, and the reality of that.
Let me switch
Rob,
over to
did you
the
wanna
issue.
get
of
Rob, we'll
your
get you
health
in. It's your show. Yeah.
Let's get into the healthcare thing too, because look, I think the NDP they're going to be hammering away on this Wyant report and this whole AHS procurement scandal. They want to see a public inquiry. And at the same time, too, was interesting timing. And let me put it to you, Erika, this announcement from the Alberta government, maybe a little bit provocative when it comes to some aspects of the Canada Health Act, with some of this allowing private insurance and out of pocket to cover things like MRIs. So what's the strategy here, first of all, do you think?
Well, it does operate under the Canada Health Act. We have it in many other jurisdictions that do something similar. So when it comes to what is the ability within the Constitution and their duty under the legislation, they're in compliance. I do think, and I had to go back and look, like, is this fall legislation? Is it spring? It reads to me like this is kind of a precursor of we're looking at this and we need to consult to understand. Like, I found it fascinating in the news release. Like, if you watch the ad they play, they talk about, or the announcement by the minister and the premier, they talk about stroke, heart disease, and cancer. And the preventative stuff, I think a lot of people can get behind. Like, yes, we should be doing more preventative testing because, one, of the impact in the health system, but more importantly, the life and livelihood of the individuals that could be diagnosed with this. So let's catch it early. But I was interested to see things like dementia and early detection and all of these options. Now, I think I'm looking at it, and I actually think the government could go farther on what their scope would be. And I hope that that's what the consultations will outline. But I actually think, I know Cheryl will argue it's two-tier healthcare system, but I think it's actually... But we have that in our country. We have it. Every province does it. We all operate within the legislation to be able to offer services. If we're sitting here arguing that people don't have access to preventative services because they get put in a list and it doesn't have the right amount of time, different conversation. But if we're actually looking at how we can address a problem of preventative care, I actually think this is one that I support that the government's doing to get to those early detection that won't have long-term impacts on that person or on the healthcare system when they get into acute care.
Yeah, Cheryl, it's interesting too. I mean, you even go back to privatizing lab services, and that turned into a mess. Some of the issues that have come out around other contracting out within AHS, that this hasn't gone well. I mean, is that kind of dangerous terrain here for the UCP with that casting a shadow over this announcement?
Yeah, I think there's a few things, and I don't disagree with Erika. This does exist in other jurisdictions in Canada, and it in fact exists currently in Alberta with Alberta's surgical health facilities that are private surgical facilities in Alberta. That doesn't mean it's the right thing to do, and it doesn't mean that it doesn't impact our public healthcare system. We've seen this kind of system rolled out in other jurisdictions, like in other international jurisdictions, where we say, like, okay, we're just going to hive off a piece here and make it private. And if you have the money and you want to do preventative diagnostic testing, we're going to open that up for you. And I think that's easy to spin as it's a very well pre-produced video that the government released about how this would help long-term in terms of diagnosing things and treating things. What we've seen in places where this is actually introduced is that we have a whole bunch of people doing these tests, finding red flags or markers or things that they're concerned about that aren't producing symptoms, and they take those to the public healthcare system. And there was a report even out of the UK, and I can't remember the exact stats, but like 90% of doctors were seeing people who were bringing flags from preventative medicine checks, and 13% of those were real checks. For those 13% of people, I think that's great. That's wonderful. But what we will see is our public healthcare system of people entering the system not for preventative private testing will be overwhelmed by people bringing their private sector tests. We will also see that at a time when we have shortages for things like radiologists and specialists, those people are going to be pulled into the private sector now, working in preventative health clinics and helping people get private diagnostic testing. And we do not have enough radiologists right now to serve our public system. And so on paper, sure, you could say this will be nice for the small percentage of people who can afford to do that. But for those who need the public system, this is going to be very detrimental to the public system. And this is not a consultation. The government announced legislative reforms.
Well, this speaks to it's been quite an overhaul of healthcare in Alberta, Erika, and the restructuring of Alberta Health Services and these different ministries. There's still challenges in the system, and I don't know it's realistic to think that she was going to be able to fix it all within a couple of years even. But does she need to show that they're making some headway, that healthcare is improving in Alberta? Can they point to those metrics at this point?
Yes and no. I mean, I think that reform does take time. This is a decade of actual implementation of reforms. I mean, it was ambitious. It could be very advantageous for this government, but it also could be very problematic going into the next election if they don't have those proof points, because as we pointed out, it doesn't happen overnight. I think where we've seen the restructuring and this being an announcement to me, and they will be legislating, Cheryl. Like, I agree with you on that. However, I just don't think it's happening immediately, was the point I was getting across. But there is definitely more work to do. I mean, they've restructured and now they have to basically give mandates and have those executions and those projects. So it is a huge political risk to overhaul the healthcare system. Do I think that it was needed? I do. I think that the judge's report showing inefficiencies within AHS definitely spoke to that, and like even the procurement process. Like, we need to do things better within our healthcare system, and I don't think anyone's denying it. But I do think they're starting to prove or show ideas that will actually help address some of those critical problems, as opposed to the alternative, which was just throw more money at the system and wish for the best.
Cheryl, let me put this question to you, because Naheed Nenshi is going to be in the House. I mean, that by-election feels like it was a long time ago, but it's taken this long for him to now be present in the Alberta Legislature. I mean, even with, a lot of these controversies and challenges for the government, I mean, it seems like the UCP are still outpolling the NDP. What does Naheed Nenshi need to do now to really kind of establish himself and to maximize the benefit of having that presence in the legislature finally?
Yeah, I mean, I think it will. Nobody's watching question period, but certainly the leader having a seat in the House makes a big difference for the party, for the clips, for the focus of the message. And I think having him there will make a difference in the effectiveness of the opposition. I think one of the big themes, because we saw the NDP now roll out sort of their, like, here's our session plan, and we've seen the government roll out what we expect in terms of legislation coming. The big difference between those pieces is that the NDP is positioning itself as focused on the things that people care about in Alberta right now. And what people care about in Alberta right now is education. Obviously, this has become much more salient given the teacher strike. They care about healthcare because despite the government's reforms, people do not have better access to healthcare today in the public system than they did when Danielle Smith became premier, and affordability and jobs. And if you look at what the government has said is in their list of legislation this fall, they're not talking about those things. They just did a whole tour across the province over the last months talking about pension, talking about a police force, which there's legislation coming on, talking about the tax changes, about how we collect taxes in Alberta. They're talking about using the notwithstanding clause to take away health access for transgender youth. These are not the things that Albertans care about. Albertans don't want to talk about license plates or Canadian citizenship markers on driver's license. They want to talk about how we make the most salient things in the province right now, the things that are impacting their daily lives, better. And Danielle Smith is not talking about that. And I think if Naheed Nenshi can focus on those things and really get across punchy messages about what the government should be doing that it is not currently doing, he will be successful.
Well, Erika, further to one point there, I mean, the whole kind of sovereignty agenda, right? I mean, the premier's going to have to make a decision on what to do coming out of the Alberta Next process. You've got potentially this Thomas Lukaszuk petition getting over the finish line. You've got potentially a Grey Cup announcement from the premier on pipelines. All of this kind of happening all around the same time. How much of a factor is this going to be in the coming weeks here, do you think?
Well, I definitely think, Cheryl and I have both been on the inside, when it comes to healthcare and when it comes to education, there's ministers that have the portfolio. The rest of the government continues to work. And so on their own respected files, right? The Minister of Service Alberta, who brought forward license plates, still has his own mandate to reach. He's not halting and being like, hello, I'd like to talk healthcare, even though I might not be the best person to do that. They have those discussions at cabinet, but they go off the expertise of the ministers that are carrying those portfolios and the premier. So just because I'll agree the healthcare system isn't where we want it to be, doesn't mean that every other ministry stops. I think for premier, the announcement of a pipeline project or something to that effect would definitely, I think, change the dial and be something from an economic standpoint that our whole country should be excited about, but obviously Alberta. But there is some conversations that they committed to having. And I think that's where what we see out of the Alberta Next panel, the jury is still out if anything carries forward. But to some people, those are what is important to them about our province. So we can't just say everyone cares about education. There's so many people I've met that are like, I don't care because my kids aren't in school, which is maybe not the best thing to say, but it's a reality for some. And so I think having these different pillars that she's focused on is strategic. Now, she said something about Naheed Nenshi and said, if he can focus his message And I picked up on that because we haven't seen Naheed Nenshi focus. We haven't seen him talk about resolutions or solutions. He just goes on the attack and goes on the fear-mongering anger. I joke as a conservative, the best thing that happened besides our parties merging was Naheed Nenshi winning the NDP leadership. And I hope that he continues to do what he does. Cheryl's right, though. They do have an opportunity in the House now to change that. I just don't have confidence that Naheed Nenshi's leadership is going to do that.
I do wonder too, Cheryl. I mean, I think, the outcome of the federal election has shaped Alberta politics so much, and it would be a completely different ballgame if the Conservatives had won. I mean, a pipeline announcement from Mark Carney would be kind of a political win for Danielle Smith, but I think maybe moving away from the fighting with Ottawa and the constant focus on these sovereignty issues. I mean, is that maybe in a way a win for Naheed Nenshi and the NDP potentially to shift the conversation in Alberta?
So I don't think that Danielle Smith getting a pipeline ends her battle with Ottawa. Danielle Smith gets so much more out of the fight than she does out of the win. That's not to say that she doesn't get a win out of a pipeline. If Mark Carney's announcing a pipeline, that's a great day for Danielle Smith, but she will find something in the same breath to fight with Ottawa over. And because that's her entire political brand. And that is what is politically salient and palatable in Alberta. And we've seen it party after party. Doesn't matter what stripe you are. It doesn't matter what leader it is. Fighting with Ottawa wins political points. And so I don't see the conversation changing, even if Danielle Smith got everything she asked for from Ottawa.
Wait, I'm curious too. Erika, you mentioned the parties merging, and I know there's the prospect of not necessarily an unmerger, but the PC party living again. Peter Guthrie is leading this charge, of course, to change the Alberta party to the PC party. Do you, or do either of you really see Peter Guthrie or this new PC party as being a factor in this session or in the months ahead?
This might be where Cheryl and I agree. We actually had Pete and Scott on our show a couple months ago, right after the party got they had the vote within the Alberta party to change it to the PCs. I think they underestimate how much work, and as someone that was president of the UCP when it was forming and all the founding AGMs, all the work that goes into it, I think they're underestimating that operational behind the scenes process. I also think that based on what we asked them and what I've heard from them before and since, I don't really know what they're running on besides being really mad at the UCP. So if the UCP balances a budget, if they're cleared of all this AHS scandal, I don't really know how the new PC party or the revamp of a PC party, what their give or their care is to Albertans to vote for them.
So I agree. Erika and I both, it would take a lot for the PCs to be successful right now. But this is a dynamic, volatile political world that we're living in right now. The Liberals got reelected in the last election. Nobody saw that coming. Right now, I agree with you, Rob. Danielle Smith's numbers are great. She is enjoying, as she has since she was elected in 23, a really nice position in the polling. But as these little things start to eat away at the government's credibility, as we get closer to the next election and there remains many things left to do and not a lot of progress shown on the things that they have done, people will start to look for alternatives. And that's up to the NDP to position itself as the obvious alternative. But for those voters that are not going to vote NDP, or for those voters that feel really strongly that the Conservative brand is their home, the PCs may be the alternative for them in the next election, that say, I'm not ready to vote NDP yet, but I could go to the PCs because I can't vote for Danielle Smith again. And like I said, we're not there yet, but there are cracks forming in the credibility of this government, and those can unravel really quickly as we near an election.
All right. Interesting couple of months ahead. As mentioned, the Discourse podcast, available on YouTube, all podcast platforms. Erika Barootes, Cheryl Oates, thank you both so much for joining us here. Appreciate the insight.
Thanks for having us.
All right. Well, our thanks once again to Erika Barootes and Cheryl Oates, co-hosts of The Discourse, very entertaining podcast focusing on Alberta and Canadian politics. And again, two political insiders and veterans, well-connected, a lot of great insight on what's going on, and just a couple of fun ladies too. So I do appreciate them making some time for us and their perspective and insight on everything going on right now in Alberta with this very important and perhaps consequential fall sitting of the legislature now underway. Well, briefly anyway, so Thursday there was one bill tabled in the legislature before the House was adjourned until Monday. And again, Monday is when we're expected to see Bill 2, which is the back to work legislation that will force an end to the teacher strike. But Bill 1 was tabled. This is the International Agreements Act.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request leave to introduce Bill 1, the International Agreements Act. This bill sends a clear message. Alberta's jurisdiction is protected, and decisions that shape our future will be made right here at home. The bill is being introduced to address gaps in current legislation beyond the limit of trade and investment to cover all agreements. If passed, international agreements impacting provincial jurisdiction will only become enforceable in Alberta if implemented under provincial legislation. With that, Mr. Speaker, I hereby move first reading of Bill 1, the International Agreements Act.
And it's interesting because I think a lot of people might be confused as to what this is all about, why this is needed, or why this was important enough that it was named Bill 1 of the government's legislative agenda. Basically, this is saying that the federal government cannot impose international agreements, or international agreements cannot be imposed upon provinces, or in this case, Alberta, without Alberta's consent, or Alberta passing legislation to enable that. Which is odd because there doesn't seem to be any example of this happening. Unless the federal government enacts legislation, international agreements are not really binding on Canada to begin with. We can sort of agree to aspire to achieve certain things in certain international agreements, but if Canada is going to agree to hard targets or hard action, typically that would involve the federal government passing a law to do that. And if that law infringes on provincial jurisdiction, well, provinces would have a case then to take the federal government to court to say your legislation is unconstitutional because it infringes on provincial jurisdiction, irrespective of whether it's meant to, live up to some international agreement. So why do we need this? What is this going to accomplish? It doesn't really seem that it changes anything. The federal government would still have to pass legislation to enact certain things, to live up to international agreements. And if it infringes on provincial jurisdiction, then Alberta already has, or any other province, pretty solid ground to object on a constitutional basis. Is this kind of grandstanding, or is this meant to be symbolic, kind of a gesture to her party's base or those that are really concerned about protecting Alberta's sovereignty and provincial jurisdiction? Or maybe this goes a little bit deeper, with kind of wild theories about the World Economic Forum or the World Health Organization or this kind of stuff. I don't know. It's hard to make sense of it. And given that the Premier can't really point to an example in the past of where this has been a problem with an international agreement, the obvious question was put to her at the news conference on Thursday. What is the point of this?
Well, I can tell you that we're not always in sync with the federal government on a variety of things. I mean, they wanted to pursue safe supply, and we're funding a number of initiatives on safe supply, which we objected to, and I'm glad to see that they turned course on that. They have a number of agreements stemming from the conversations that happen at the international table, and we're drawing a line. We're saying that they cannot make decisions in our areas of jurisdiction at an international table without including us. Quebec has found a reason to have this policy. They go through a very elaborate process when international agreements are signed onto, and we just want to set the precedent that there may be many places where we agree. And in fact, on international trade agreements where we have existing legislation, we do have a process where we go through and affirm international trade agreements. This just expands it to include all agreements that the federal government might enter into that impact our jurisdiction.
Okay, so again, it's hard to see what the point of this is or what this is supposed to accomplish. It is kind of symbolic. You can call it virtue signaling, I guess. But there's also the question of why this as Bill 1? It's interesting when the Premier talks about how important it is to resolve the teachers' strike, get kids back to class, and they're moving, they're acting. The question was put to her on Thursday, well, why wasn't that Bill 1? Why have you made the back to work legislation Bill 2? Why has that been put off till Monday? If that's such an important priority, why not make that Bill 1? And instead, why did we get this Bill 1? Why is this issue such a priority? It was clearly not a question the Premier appreciated all that much. Here's what she said to that.
Well, we have a legislative agenda that wasn't foreseeing that we would be in the middle of a teacher strike. So Bill 2 is the Back to School Act, which will address that. So we have 14 pieces of legislation. This will be the first one, but there's many others, and you'll be able to hear about that in the throne speech. But make no mistake, we know that this strike is causing harm to kids, We know it's causing harm to teachers since there isn't a strike fund, and we want to be able to end it for the sake of both frontline teachers as well as students and their families so that we can get back to a learning environment. So that will be debated as quickly as we possibly can, which is on Monday.
And my follow-up to that is Bill 1 doesn't seem to have any obvious urgency. It doesn't seem like there's an immediate impending international agreement that Alberta is taking issue with. So is this an attempt to distract from the teacher strike right now?
Well, as I mentioned, the process for developing legislation takes place months and months in advance of it being implemented. So we didn't know months and months ago that we were going to be in the middle of a teacher strike. And we can do two things at once, which is why we can continue with our legislative agenda, which we've been planning for many months. And we can also accelerate Bill 2, which will be the first bill debated on Monday.
Okay, so that was talking about Bill 1, as mentioned, that was tabled in the legislature on Thursday, and that was pretty much it. You have the speech from the throne, Bill 1 was tabled, and the legislature was adjourned until Monday. So what to watch for, obviously, is the back to work legislation the Premier says is coming on Monday. I guess it's theoretically possible you could see something happen, some kind of movement between the Alberta government and the Alberta Teachers Association before then. Although at this point, it's hard to envision that. And I would imagine that, word of back to work legislation has just kind of exacerbated a lot of the tension there. But at the same time, is there an opportunity maybe to get a better deal at the table before going down this path of back to work legislation or some kind of arbitration, maybe something for the Teachers Association to consider? So we'll see what transpires there over the next couple of days. And as mentioned, expecting that back to work legislation on Monday. And we'll see what else comes as the legislature gets into full swing next week. Don't forget, you can find us, follow us, robbreakenridge.ca, and this podcast, of course, on YouTube, all of the podcast channels. We also have a new episode of the Line Alberta podcast for you coming out on Wednesday. I imagine we'll be taking a closer look at where things stand in this teachers' dispute in the aftermath of back to work legislation, assuming that does indeed come on Monday. Have yourselves a fantastic weekend, folks. My name is Rob Breakenridge. Thanks for joining us here. We'll talk to you next week. Take care. Hey, folks, thanks for watching and listening. You can find us at robbreakenridge.ca. Also, make sure you hit that subscribe button below and stay connected with The Rob Breakenridge Show.